We wanted to really start by talking a bit about what have our learning objectives been through the week. So we've been thinking about reviewing and understanding the practice model that we are all working under and how the items are really drawn from an understanding of the CANS New York. We've talked about the eligibility determination. We've talked about how that works in particular with the algorithms. We walked through those both Monday and yesterday. We've talked a bit about how we really assess for those HCBS specific items. We've talked about how we're going to really think about these in terms of action levels. And we've also talked a lot about how some of those extension modules and items really affect the eligibility determination by really looking at a few specific examples, some of those vignettes that we shared with you. And we were able to really look at and explore what some of these stories could really look like in real life. And so as we move forward now, today is really all about you, and it's all about exploring what your questions were, what the pieces are that you wanted us to do some deeper dives into. You guys have been awesome about really putting a lot of those questions forward to us throughout the last 2 days, some of which we've kind of answered in the stream as we've been training, but also a lot of those we've been kind of packing away. A lot of you have sent those via email. And so Susie and I have been kind of creating a Q&A list. And in doing that, also then pulling out some slides and some materials that we have from some of our former trainings. And so what we're going to share with you today is based on some of your questions, some of what we've really pulled out of some of the other materials that we already had kind of in our back pocket from some other trainings that we've done. But also we really want to kind of address all of those questions as they come up for you, and really try to address some of the key topics that have surfaced throughout the last few days. So I mentioned it once as we were kind of getting ready, and more of you have joined us since. So we want to encourage you all to continue to drop those questions in. This morning, some folks, even after we moved on to other topics, some folks kind of had some aha questions that came up, and we were happy to circle right back around and get to those. So feel free, even if we've moved past the topic that you're thinking about, if your brain is still working on that, pop the question in the chat box, and we'll find a way to segue back to that and make sure that we answer your question. You guys have been great about raising the hands and popping in with those questions verbally, so please continue to do that as well. And Susie and I will both monitor that and give you a chance to say your piece. So with that, let's move forward. So one of the areas that we received a lot of questions and feedback and folks wanting to be thoughtful about was around the idea of how do I really build engagement? How do I, with the short amount of time that I have and with the means that I have at my disposal, really think about building relationships with kids and families that will then help them to share with me the important information that I need to know in order to do my job. And so we wanted to start by talking a little bit about what actually is engagement and what does that look like to the various partners involved in that engagement. And so one of the places that we like to start is really by thinking about what engages a family and what do families tell us engages them. Right, and so we have lots of different places where we can kind of pull this type of information from. There's been a lot of work done in the mental health field. There's been a lot of work done in the medical health field, right, around what makes people feel good about their experiences working with helping professionals. And so this is something that we had pulled and we use in one of our other trainings that comes from the Children's Mental Health Center in Michigan, but we think is really valuable information that applies to all of the work that we do, right? One of the things that we know and we hear from families is when they tell us what engages them, one of the key items is this idea that they feel that they are being heard. And this can be, we as helping professionals might often think that the person we are working with feels like they're being heard, but we may not always be presenting to them in the way that we feel that we are, right? We are busy people. We all have our own families, our own problems, our own needs and strengths, right? And so even when we might be present, in a family's living room when that's possible, or via a Zoom call or some other method when, when we're doing our work in the modern age, we want to be thoughtful about, does the family really feel like we are listening to them, like we are really absorbing and understanding their story, right? And we're going to talk a bit about that in a few slides around what are some of the skills that we can employ and some of the strategies that we can put forth to really help families feel that they are being heard. But we we want to recognize that when families are asked that, what engages you? It's feeling like the person on the other end of that conversation is really getting it and is really there and on that journey with them and doesn't come in with their own agenda, right? But they're really and truly ready to work and be present with that family. And then along with that goes having a say in decisions, right? That families don't want to feel like they're just going to spew their story to you and then you're going to just tell them what they're going to get, right? Or tell them what they need, or tell them here's what's going to happen, right? They want to be a part of that decision process. And it's important to kind of read that sentence the right way, right? Having a say in decisions. Families understand that some decisions are going to sort of be system oriented and are going to be impacted by, by the system kind of telling them what's available or helping them, run through, such as, an HCBS eligibility type of decision process, but they want to have a part in that process. And that's where really thinking about these items that we are collaboratively rating with them is critical to that piece, right? Because by them being thoughtful and being willing to share with us what their needs and strengths really are, that's part of them having that say, right, about the eligibility, because by them giving us that information and helping us to understand their story better, we are able to reflect that through these items that we are completing ratings on, and ultimately, arrive at the determination that makes the most sense for them, be it eligibility or something else, right? And families like and feel engaged by individualized planning, right? Families don't enjoy feeling like they're just part of a cookie cutter process, right? And so part of our work, even though we may do a very similar assessment, right, with many, many families that we serve, it's part of our job and it's incumbent on us to make every family understand and feel that it really is individualized to them, right? And that includes the ways in which we speak to them and the language that we use, right? Speaking in language that we think is matching what a family needs and the ways in which they communicate. And it includes how we talk about their kids and talk about their family situations, right, in ways that are individualized and are thoughtful to them. Families, what engages them is they feel like being understood, not being blamed, not being judged, but simply being understood for who they are and where they are in the world is a real critical piece. They like having a complete understanding of the resources available to them, right? I think that's something that we probably do pretty well already, but it's important for us to be thoughtful about, right? How are we sharing the information around the HCBS services, around our own role in the process, around all of the other pieces and the other professionals that might be involved with that child and family? How are we helping a family to really understand everything that is available to them, everything that they are using, and how those pieces interact, which again is something maybe at times we might really have that deeper knowledge of than a family might, to really help them understand how all these pieces fit together in a way that is hopefully helping them. And then families also feel engaged by, having access to that quality care, right? Families feel listened to and engaged when the results come out in their favor, when they feel like their child has become eligible and now has access to the services that make the most sense to them. So the next piece of this then is to think about what might disengage them, right? What might actually get in the way of good, solid engagement. And before we bring up that side of the slide, we want to invite you to be thoughtful around this. What do you tend to see as being challenges to developing good, effective engagement with families? And what might some of those barriers look like to you as a provider, but also you kind of putting yourself in the mind of the kids and the families that you serve? What might some of those barriers look like to them? Go ahead and chat that in now, or if you want to share those verbally, you're welcome to do that. So some of the pieces being shared are that parents, it's scrolling too fast. I was reading and it scrolled off. Let me see. So parents being understandably defensive or guarded, that was shared by Karen, Rachel talking about initially when they don't understand the program. Robin mentions the family may perceive you as intrusive. And Melissa talks about teenagers are guarded. They may think that this is unnecessary. So I'm sensing kind of that theme right here, right around one of the barriers to good engagement can be kids and families not really seeing who we are, the value of who we are and what we might represent as far as our role in the system and the overall programs available to them, right? So why are you here? Why do I care, right? Prove to me that this kind of matters. Right. Susie, do you mind taking over for a second?
Not at all. So, right, we're thinking about, right, people who, oh, so I see here that people are chatting in. Somebody is afraid, not wanting to disclose, protecting their children's identity, right? Um, and also people think that CPS might be brought in, right? And so there's a lot here about people being guarded, right? That is, right, it's a barrier to engagement from our perspective, but it actually is the stuff of what needs to be addressed and assessed for engagement. And I'm just wanting to know if people can hear me. Can you chat in that you can hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Josh froze up for a minute and I want to make sure that was on his end and not on my end. So, right, so we experience these pieces of folks' responses, which are substrates of their resistance to engagement with us, right? And so one of the things we want to think about is when we see any of these different flavors that you've been talking about here, we want to think about two little barriers to engagement called mistrust and distrust, okay? Josh, I don't know if you can hear me, but can you click the next slide? Not the next slide, but the next. Okay, let's hold on, gang. I am gonna grab the screen for a second and go back to my version of the slides. So when people come to us with all of the different ways that you're describing them being guarded, right? They are actually showing us two kinds of hesitation to engage with us. One is called mistrust and one is called distrust, okay? So why are those two words different? Well, mistrust has to do with learned experience. And what that means is I've been in the system for some time and I know that you are not necessarily going to be protective of me and my family. I've had some experiences with the system where the system has let me down, right? So what that means then, hold on, I'm gonna get to that slide. What that means then is we have to think about the things that people have experienced in the past that have built a sense of mistrust and distrust, right? So mistrust is when I personally mistrust you around our relationship. And that mistrust can come from my own past history, right? My own feelings of guardedness, right? Distrust comes when I am educated and experienced in the ways that the system doesn't hear me, doesn't respect me, systematically discriminates against me, right? Or ultimately lets me down in terms of being culturally responsive and supporting meaningful outcomes that are meaningful to my family and my child. So we want to think about those barriers to engagement that we experience as little signals that we have to work hard at being different than people's experiences with past systems, right? And so some of the behaviors that are on this disengagement list are what we want to focus in on. Now, you know, nobody goes into this doing any of these things intentionally, right? Often with the best of intentions, we move forward, we make choices without families, right? So they want to be part of the decision-making process. But the other piece, right, is that sometimes they feel judged, or when they say what they need or what they feel, they're not feeling heard. And they also think sometimes, and I gave an example this morning of sticker charts, right? That I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and in my business, a lot of family folks will say to the parents, well, if you can't get them to behave, why don't you try a sticker chart, right? And some parents will tell me, do you know what it's like to have 3 kids and work 2 shifts and just try and make sure everybody's got 3 meals a day, lunch, homework done, ready to get on the bus in the morning? Sticker charts are not something that I can attend to. And so considering the impact of our interventions on the entire family, or our recommendations, right? Also, people hear and they will tell us again and again that they've had that distrust building experience because their concerns haven't been taken seriously, right? That providers come in with their own professional and cultural views. And so we want to sort of work on those barriers by being extra especially careful to take the time to stay away from these behaviors that lead to increased disengagement. So when we're up against what you all were describing, when we're up against mistrust, distrust, guardedness, a resistance to disclose, and a resistance to participate that comes from, right, really often an experienced place with systems, we have some strategies that we know when we study what works help us build engagement in an environment where people are guarded. The first one may seem straightforward, but it's actually, as you well know, with folks who are hesitant to engage with us, harder than it looks. And that's the creation of safety, right? We're going to talk a little bit about our own cultural biases and lenses, right? But we want to make sure that we use strategies that are explicitly designed to help people gradually feel safe by, first of all, using all those engagement strategies, taking the time, listening, being transparent, right? We also want to mind our nonverbal communication, right? So this is an important one, and families will tell you that they've had many experiences with professionals who don't make eye contact, aren't warm with them, are focused on the paperwork or the checklist, make power gestures, right? Cross their arms, turn their bodies away, put their hands up on their heads, right? And also when we're non-verbally communicating with families and kids, this is even more important virtually, right? So when I'm communicating with you non-verbally on the screen, I have to be sure to notice what it is that I look like on the screen. I have to make sure you can hear me, you can see me, and that it's clear that I'm interacting with you, right? So it's even harder virtually, but nonverbals also have to be culturally responsive, right? Which means some people are more and less comfortable with different levels of eye contact, right? And who do you look at in a family when you're speaking, those kinds of things. One of the things families and young people tell us again and again is that it never hurts to overtly express kindness, the intention to want to help, and compassion for the challenges that a young person and their caregivers are experiencing. And I told the story this morning of a young man who came back into my private practice recently after several years away at college, who I knew when he was in high school. And he was very sarcastic and very shut down and very acerbic in high school. And still, I took the time to say to him, I know that you're hurting, and I'm here to try and help you with that in any way. I don't want to see you hurting, right? Even if he didn't say, oh, thank you, I am hurting, he would say something sarcastic like, oh, yeah, that's like what my parents are paying you to say to me, right? But when I expressed that kindness and compassion, somehow it landed, right? And he came back to me a few years later and said, you know, I always knew you were on my side. I always knew you really wanted to find me and help me, right? And so we have to really take the time when parents and when kids are guarded and they don't want to talk to us to express that intention to help and that compassion for what their challenges are. We also want to use language that's reflective of the style of the family. So everybody tells us to stay away from jargon, but it's more subtle than that. We want to listen to how the family frames their struggles. We want to listen to their cultural style and their narrative style, and we want to reflect that back to them. That doesn't mean that I'm going to try and start talking like I'm from an inner city environment or using slang with a teenager. Clearly, that's going to make me look like an idiot and disengage me from the teenager. But what it means is that if a family defines something in a certain way, I can start to use those words back to them. So a great example of this is, right, some families will tell you that if they have diabetes, they will say, my grandma has the sugars and I don't want to get the sugars, right? So it's learning. Yes, we're all distracted. Raise your hand if you're distracted by Isaac's beauty and that glorious hair, right? He's just an amazing little guy. So, right, so we might say to them, right, then, okay, so you're telling me you have you don't then reflect back, okay, your grandmother has type 1 diabetes. what are the lifestyle changes that you're planning on using to combat your own genetic tendencies to take on type 2 diabetes? We say, oh, okay, so there's sugars in your family. So what have you learned about managing that? And have you ever been told by any doctors that you might have sugars? Right, so that we're starting to develop that respect and that reflection for the way that the youth and the family communicate. And finally, and really it can't be overstated, that the maintenance of transparency serves to gradually alleviate those feelings of guardedness and fear and mistrust and distrust that families and kids can feel when they've worked with systems and they're on guard. And when I say transparency, I mean taking the time to explain what we're doing and what it's for, right? And we've talked a lot about that, right? Yesterday we talked about introducing the domains as here's what I'm going to ask and here's why I'm going to ask, right? But also here's what this eligibility determination is for. It opens the door for these services that can help. And the more I know, the more I'm going to be able to help you get through that door to get those services. Mm-hmm. So thinking about all of that and putting it into a big package, we want to learn to collaborate with the entire family system. Because when people are guarded, when people are mistrustful, right, the more that we can expand the system and connect to it, the stronger our bond is going to be, right? So we are going to work to engage everyone, okay? And we're going to make sure that it's clear to every member of the family that they are equally important in our eyes. And that includes things like asking them what they think, reflecting back what they think, negotiating their concerns into the goals and into the action level ratings, right? Ensuring that you listen and include everyone. So Josh and I were on a webinar about a year ago, and he got fired up because somebody said, well, a care manager said to us, well, you know, I'm working with a family and the father works about 15 hours a week. He works in a garage. It's a couple of, it's a long drive from where the family lives. I can never get in contact with him. He's never home. So he's not really part of the parenting, right? I don't have to interview him, right? Josh, do you have silence? Can you answer? Can you say what you said about that to the participant?
Yeah, so, you know, we talked about a couple of points, one of which was, you know, the recognition that parenting is about a lot more than just what we do when we're one-on-one with our kids, right? That parenting includes all of the work we do to create a safe and a healthy environment for them to develop. Yeah, buddy.
Does this say big light tower?
It does.
Speaking of fatherhood.
Such as, yeah. But what else does it include, right? It includes, you know, it includes creating a financial safety and a financial network for our children, right? So dad working, you know, 14 hours a day and spending a lot of time away from the home was doing a really important bit of the parenting, right? It was providing, you know, for having a place to live, having food, having all of the financial resources that are necessary for kids to develop healthy. And it also was not excluding the fact that, of course, he still spent time with his kids, maybe not as much as the spouse did in the one-on-one type of situations, but recognizing that there are still plenty of other opportunities where both of the caregivers have opportunities to really make a dramatic impact on the development of those children. And so, you know, we want to be really thoughtful around that, and that it can be an easy way out to just simply say, well, let's just rate the caregiver who we have access to or who's around more frequently. But it can really get in the way of us having a really true understanding of the child's story, right? Because we know, you know, any of us that have been raised by two or more caregivers knows that all of them had an impact on who we are today. Did they have an equal impact? No, of course not, because they were different people and they each had different skills and had different quirks of personality and different, and with them we had different experiences, some of them when they were together, some of them when they were apart, and all of those impact us as developing human beings. And so we want to be really thoughtful about that and recognize everyone's contributions.
Yeah, well said. You know, I think that what Josh is describing, right, is that importance, right? The importance of including everyone, the importance of taking the time. And this might be a workflow issue, right? We had talked in this morning's webinar about the, you know, thinking about dusting off your workflow and making sure that it supports that collaborative process, because We want to be communicating with each family member and obtaining information and perspective. And when they're resistant to talking with us, we want to make sure they know the reason why, right? Doubling back to transparency. Each one of you has a unique and highly valuable view of what's going on in your child's life and what your child's needs are. And I cannot do my work without all that important information, right? As opposed to that stance of, come on, you're his dad. Don't you want to get on the phone with me, right? That's a black and white, but we don't even want to slightly take that attitude. I want to double back to a few of the chats that are coming in about the previous slide, which are really powerful. Angela and Gus have both texted in some ideas. So Angela is saying that, one of the primary barriers to engagement is presenting a solution that you've come up with to a family with no input from them. And I want to tell you how many times, right, in our lives, we experience that process, right, where someone in the healthcare or social service profession tells the service recipient what's going to happen without collaborative input. John Lyons, who's the developer of the TCOM approach, describes the way that his doctor got him to lower his blood pressure. And the way his doctor did that was he put up on a screen John's blood pressure, and he had a little program that calculated John's lifespan. And he showed John, with your current blood pressure, your lifespan is going to be this, your average lifespan. But if you lower your blood pressure to this with just medication, your lifespan goes here. And if you lower your blood pressure even further with medication, diet, and exercise, your lifespan goes here. What would you like to do? Contrast that with a doctor who says, you have high blood pressure, I'm putting you on medication, pick up your prescription at the pharmacy, right? And so what Angela is saying, right, is the barrier to engagement sometimes has to do with, I am the professional, I have a lot of knowledge to bring to the table. Nobody's saying that's not important. It is important. But the way that I bring it, elevating and valuing the expertise of the consumer and the family, can really reduce barriers to engagement. And Gus is talking about, right, the profound impact, Gus, in your text. This story is really beautiful about compassion, that when he worked in inpatient settings and patients had to be put in 4-point restraints back in the day, right, that he would always express mindful, compassionate thoughts to the individual, right? And he said sometimes days later, the patient would come up and apologize to Gus for the incident, because the patient was hearing the impact, right? The impact of that compassion landed, even though the person was in crisis, even though the person might have been floridly psychotic, right? Still aware of the person who overtly expressed compassion and the person who didn't, right? So that's a really great story, just bringing home the importance of that. Thanks, Gus. So the other piece we want to talk about when we're talking about engagement, and it's so relevant in our time right now, is this issue of creating safety. When we think about creating safety, we mentioned it a few slides ago, we have to think a little bit about what people are capable of in terms of feeling safe. And this is a little hierarchy of safety needs, right? So at the very base here in the purple part of the triangle, right, people who are food insecure and housing insecure and physically unsafe, that's up in the green, it's very hard for them to feel engaged and safe and relational with us, right? And so another piece of engagement comes from thinking about where the person is in this hierarchy and how we can focus on maybe practical needs and instrumental needs if we're unable to build a connected, engaged relationship. And that then, right, sort of the more relational needs start to come more naturally once we've focused on that, okay? So we want to check in around engagement with an important piece of engagement, and that is self-awareness. So when families come in and they talk with us about times where they felt engaged versus times where they didn't, often they'll tell us things like, I felt subtly judged, or I felt the person didn't hear me or didn't understand me. And I don't think any of us gets into work in human serving systems with the idea that we want to judge people or be biased, right? But we have to be humble because the human brain is an inherently biased brain, right? When we think about brain science, what we know about human brains is this. Human brains develop little shortcuts, right? Little quick processing shortcuts. So a great example of this comes from cognitive science, where if I take all of you, if we had the good luck to actually be in the same room, which might be a lot more fun than being on Zoom, and I said, hey, it's my birthday today. I'm going to take all of you in the next room. We're going to have a little birthday party. And I broke you up into groups, and we went in and we had a birthday party. And at the birthday party, I had presents, and I had little crowns for everybody. And we sang happy birthday. Somebody's not on mute. Somebody's cat is meowing and we're not on mute. And I put little crowns on you, and I opened presents and you sang happy birthday, and we had a little punch. And then we all went back in a room, and I gave you a little survey, and I said, can you tell me what you just experienced? About 90%, 85 to 90% of you would check off that you experienced cake or cupcakes, even if I didn't serve them to you. Why is that? Because your brain has created a shortcut. It's something you've experienced many, many times, something you've learned about through experience, and there's almost always some cake-like treat at a birthday party, right? So we have to understand that our life, our repeated experience teaches us shortcuts about what we think is normal, natural, the baseline for behavior, the baseline for parenting. And so when we go into a situation that is unfamiliar with us, those lenses are actually there, right? And so we're not going in saying we want to be biased or racist. We're going in just being ourselves, right? And then our professional training adds another layer to that, right? Then we have that professional lens. For many of you, it's that nursing lens. For me, it's that psychology lens. And so this impacts actually how we process the world, because it impacts what we perceive to be a benchmark, right, for what is natural, normal, regular. So we want to encourage people, when we think about engagement, to understand that that lens is actually part of what can, if we're not careful, get in the way of engagement. So it's important, as we're engaging with our clients and we're feeling their guardedness, to start with our own bad selves and say, what am I feeling and thinking right now? And what do I really know about this child, this youth, this family member who's giving me a tough time, who doesn't want to engage with me? Do I truly understand their perspective? And sometimes the perspective we need to work to understand is the reason they're not engaging with us, because of their history, because of their concerns, okay? And so to work against our lens and our reactions, right? We just want to be aware that we have to be fairly self-reflective, right? That whenever we find ourselves coming up against challenges around engagement, the place we need to start is self-management. Surrendering any assumptions, any biases, any judgments about why this person is acting the way they're acting, right? And for many of us, particularly if you were raised in the middle class, right? The way that you interact with a healthcare service provider has a certain set of rules around it, right? And so it may not be true for the people that you're working with. And setting those biases and judgments about how they're coming forward aside, right? And understanding that the interference of our own lens can actually, with the best of intentions, get in the way of our openness to where the folks we're at actually are. Before we move on, I just want to check in about that. Anyone want to chime in, talk about an experience, offer some thoughts about that work, times when they've had to do that work and it's really been powerful for them? I remember the first time in my career, I was, I think, I don't know, maybe 12 months out of graduate school. I sat with a mom who had 4 kids and lived in the Bronx, and I started talking to her in family therapy session about her tone and her volume with her kids. And she turned around and she said, Dr. Button, I live in the Bronx. I have 4 kids. 2 of my kids are very, very little. If they go to the edge of the subway platform and they don't listen to me when I tell them to come back, they could get killed. And sometimes in the subway and sometimes in the city, I have to talk really loud. My tone has nothing to do with how much I love my kids. And that was just one of those moments. I've never forgotten it. That was probably 25 years ago that that woman said that to me. And it was like, aha, right? Whoops. That was my bias, right? That was my lens. Good parents don't have to always be talking like Mr. Rogers to their kids. Just because I was in love with Mr. Rogers as a kid doesn't mean everyone has to parent like that. Okay. Any other thoughts about this one? Lots of smiles, lots of interesting looks on faces, but nobody's commenting right now. Well, feel free to come on in. So the last piece, yeah, Gus, what were you going to say something?
Yeah, I had a bit of a kind of a funny story, but it does speak to this. You know, all the time I have 4 kids, and when they were smaller, whenever we'd go to like a restaurant or whatever, a lot of times I'd have random people come up and say, "My God, your children are so well behaved." And one time, I looked at the woman deadpan and said, "Well, yeah, we beat them." And she just completely froze, didn't know what to say. And
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like it's a joke, right? Maybe for her it wasn't a joke, but
No.
yeah. But even that, right? Definitions of what good behavior are vary highly among families too, and so yeah.
And that, I mean, you know, just on a more serious note, like there was one time that we went to my wife's aunt coming from out of town, and we took her to the water club, and walking in there with 4 small kids, some of the patrons and even some of the staff were at first a little apprehensive, and towards the end of the meal, they were coming up, giving my daughter's stuff, and you saw the definite change in everyone's attitude once they saw how they were behaved, because they were expecting something completely different.
Now, in case people don't know what the Water Club is, it's a restaurant on the Hudson River in Manhattan. It is very fancy and very high end, and many of the elite like to go eat and drink there. I guess we can talk offline about some trouble I used to get into at the Water Club when I was in my 20s. So let's talk now about another, right? We want to sort of flip the frame on engagement, and we want you to think about something that the research shows us about what we call protective factors. When families are hesitant, when families seem fragile, when families are guarded, right? One of the things that's helpful for me is to think about the things that we know strengthen families. These are protective factors. In the research, we find if a family is dealing with some kind of adversity, particularly when a child has a psychiatric challenge or a medical challenge or a developmental delay or a combination of those things, as we've talked about, the more of these protective factors that are present in the family, the stronger the family's capacity to handle that additional stressor, right? And so sometimes it helps when you're struggling with engagement to sort of go down this checklist for yourself and sort of try and provide supports that build these resiliences before you try to engage too deeply, right? So the first is parental resilience, right? Remember we talked about parenting stress yesterday? We talked about it as analogous to pain, right? So parents come into parenting with different levels of resilience. I like to tease Josh on these webinars, but I've been watching him for the last 3 months parent 2 young children while working full time. about half the time on the Zoom screen while we're all watching him parent his 2 young children. If I have 13-year-olds, so thankfully my parenting is a little more hands-off. If I had to do what he's doing, I probably would have had a nervous breakdown by now. Josh has a great deal of temperamental resilience. He's very unflappable. And he's also, someone said when I said this the other day, he's also younger than you, and that's true, right? But we want to think about how stress tolerant is this parent, and are there ways I can help alleviate that stress for the parent? Another piece that is a strong protective factor that's particularly fragile right now during COVID are social connections. The more social connections that the child and youth and or the caregivers identify as their, they use different words, their tribe, their extended family, their neighborhood, their friend group, their besties, who they go to, right? And remember that the caregivers and the youth can have different sets of groups, but the more of those rich connections they have, the more resilient and strong the family will be, right? So sometimes if a family won't engage with us, we can help them start working to identify ways that they can engage with their natural supports. Concrete supports, right? And we talked about that a minute ago, right? That we can't really build resilience unless we build instrumental support, right? What do they actually need in terms of transportation or food security or housing? The next one is very powerful. Often we come into our work with families, they're guarded, they're challenged, they're stressed out, and they actually don't have the knowledge that they need, right? Often when kids are receiving diagnoses, parents aren't given the time and the support to process the knowledge that goes along with that diagnosis and how to work with that child. One of the most powerful services, and we talked about this, right, that parent peer support service is so powerful because parents have been through the receiving of a diagnosis and the challenge of learning on the fly when you're also grieving that your child has received this label and may be ill or may be challenged with a developmental disorder or have psychiatric challenges. Parents who are having that emotional stress aren't processing on all cognitive cylinders. And so moving in with the kinds of supports that can shore up their knowledge at their pace and their learning style and their learning capacity is really important and can actually improve engagement. Social and emotional competence of the children and youth in the family is a protective factor for the whole family. So you can start to see already those children who you're working with who are in that SCD group, the families are challenged there because that's one of the family-wide resilience factors. And so when we walk in from this protective factors approach, it gets a lot easier to start parsing out reasons why a family might be stressed, might be intensely guarded with us, and might be just trying to manage on the day-to-day without feeling ready to engage. Josh, you want to add anything?
No, actually, I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay. So, the other piece we want to just talk about, because we had a lot of questions about this in the chat and then through the email question submission. I think you all are already in a position where you do some of your work by phone, right? But in the COVID environment, we're almost completely shut down from that nice person-to-person contact, right? And so we got a lot of questions about, gosh, what do I do when I have to do it all by phone or I have to do it all virtually? So I wanted to point you to this URL. Josh is going to walk you through the CANS New York Institute website, which is where this, oh my gosh, I am looking, Josh, at what I like to watch, right? It's clearly not all me. There's my YouTube algorithm showing for everybody to look at. Dogs, dancing, and Barack Obama. That says it all. That's what it's all about for me, right? That's the way I'm getting through. I'm just wishing I had a puppy, thinking about dancing, and fantasizing that Barack Obama is still my president. So that's how I'm making it through the day these days. So here at this URL is an 1.5-hour webinar that we did and recorded on specific strategies for conducting assessment collaboratively via the phone or the web. There are subsections of the webinar that are just about strategies for the phone, and there are subsections of the webinar that are just about strategies for the web. You can get it by going to the CANS-NY Institute resource page and scrolling down. And we have the slides in there as a downloadable PDF, and you also can go to the YouTube embedded link and watch that webinar. So that's one really great strategy for the COVID crisis and for virtual work resource, sorry. The other resource I want to point out to you is a resource that you may not know about, but it comes from the mental health side of children's services in New York State. It's the MTAC-CTAC Center at NYU. CTAC is the Center for Technical Assistance for Children, and it is an OMH-funded center. But what they have done, they're an amazing team, and they've done a lot of work pulling together lots of experts from across the state who've quickly developed and presented webinars on virtual treatment and engagement strategies. And I did one for them on family therapy, but there are lots and lots of resources that speak directly to some of your questions around how do I do this work when I'm tied down to my house, and how do I do this work creatively when people are so high need in such a difficult time. So if you go to this website, you'll see this little purple page, and if you just scroll down, you'll see webinar after webinar, and you can click on any of them and watch them live. CTAC does ask you to enter a little email or something, and that's because they are grant funded and they have to report how many people they touch. And so really they're not gonna send you a bunch of stuff, but this is a tremendously rich resource that all of you can feel free to tap into. Really good stuff there. So before we move on to another area of questions, they touch the so Colette is teasing me on the chat. So any questions about any of the conversation about engagement that we've had so far, or comments or things you wish we had covered that we hadn't? Okay. Another theme in a lot of the questions and some of the chats yesterday was this theme about how to navigate tension and disagreement about what is going on in the life of the consumer, right? And often the questions centered around talking about sensitive topics. So if you could right now, just chat in for everybody to see what are some of the topics that for you find sort of sensitive to approach with families. Yeah, so trauma, sexual topics, sexuality, abuse of any kind, sexual abuse, sexual orientation. Good. Yeah, so these are commonly some of the subjects that people feel challenged to talk about. And so we're gonna sort of give you some strategies to hang your hat on around some of these topics of conversation. It's also important before we launch into the strategies that we think a little bit about that issue of culture in our own lens. Interestingly, right, different cultures find different subject matter sensitive, and some cultures don't find subject matter sensitive, right? So one great example of this is money. Right? In some cultures, if you ask people what their income level is, they're happy to tell you. In other cultures, that's considered inherently private, and that's none of your damn business, right? So in addition to the topics that we're listing, the ones that we know are sensitive for us and for the people we serve, we also have to be sensitive to the fact that there might be other things that we might trip upon that might be sensitive to the folks we're serving. So we're going to try and focus in on how do we use a strength-based approach to approach sensitive information and to build consensus when there's disagreement. So first of all, we've already sort of talked about this, right? But we cannot emphasize it enough. Your internal reactions, or this is a care management slide. We pulled these together in the wee hours of this morning, but this is for you as well. Any discomfort, anxiety, or bias can predict how a conversation will go. So if you're uncomfortable for whatever reason, and there's no value judgment on your discomfort, right? You may come into a conversation about sexuality or religion or trauma with a sense of anxiety and discomfort of your own, and that's okay, right? But remember what we talked about, self-reflection and self-management. It's understanding how we can set that aside, right, in order to be curious and comfortable and a safe person to ask the questions of the client, right? Lots of times, right, supervision is an important place for that. Having close colleagues with whom you can ethically and comfortably voice your challenges and concerns, really important place to get yourself steady. And then of course, right, it's the caregiver and the youth reactions, right? Their reactions also predict, it goes without saying, how the conversation will go. And so we want to use some strategies that can't eliminate their reactions, but can soften and support their feelings of safety and normalcy so that as they talk about things, they can feel more comfortable. And that goes to what we're going to talk about next. The way that you ask questions about sensitive subjects can predict how the conversation will go, because it can really support them feeling safe and normalized, or it can put them a little bit more on alert. So here are some of the strategies we want to encourage you to use in terms of interview approaches. So first of all, right, always, and I think I forgot to say this today, we think about engagement not as a one and done, but more as a cycle. I sort of check out where you're at with our relationship and where we are. I check on what any barriers are to engagement and forward collaboration. I work on addressing those, and then we continue the work. I check in again, right? So always keeping an eye on engagement. Part of an engagement strategy is this idea of preparation. Okay, now what I mean by preparation is letting people know at the beginning in that transparent way that we've talked about. I'm going to be asking you about a lot of stuff. Some of it's going to be kind of sensitive stuff, right? The reason I'm going to be asking you is because the more I know about these areas and any challenges you have in these areas, the more I can get you paired up with the right kinds of services, right? But remember, at any time, if you don't want to talk about something I'm asking you about, you can let me know that, right? I'm not going to, I want to ask you in a way that helps you feel safe, right? That should happen early on in the assessment process. It's a sort of a, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Columbo, right? Columbo is a detective. Yeah, right. Some of you remember. Good, right? So he used to set up his interview subjects by sort of saying, yeah, you know, sometimes I lose track of my thinking, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to figure out that you're the killer, right? And then he'd sort of circle around in a wacky way and start asking them increasingly pointed questions as they got more and more and more relaxed and comfortable with him, right? And so we want to sort of throw out, we are going to get there, and then move away from it and do some less anxiety-provoking work. Always fully transparent. Make sure the kid, the family knows why you're asking the questions. And importantly, normalizing, right? So using phrases like, many of the kids I work with tell me that some scary or challenging things have happened to them in their life. Anything like that for you? So listen to how that's different than saying, now we're going to talk about whether or not you've had any adverse trauma experiences in your life. It's very normalizing. And I love doing this with little kids because sometimes they'll say, yeah, and then they'll tell you something like, the other day, my cat jumped off my bed and knocked over my elmo, and I was really scared, right? And then you say, wow, that sounds really scary. Anything else that's happened in your life, right? But you're just starting where the person is, right? Same with parents. I ask all parents about this. A lot of parents with a kid who has medical diagnoses feel a lot more stress than parents of kids who don't. How about you? How's your stress level, right? Listen to how normalizing that is. That has no pathology in it. It doesn't make it sound like it's unusual, right? And it isn't. Parenting stress is not unusual, right? Raise your hand if you've felt parenting stress in the last month. In the last minute, Josh, have you felt any parenting stress in the last minute? Raise your hand. right? So the idea is to really use that normalizing strategy. Be specific without being intrusive, right? And you hear how I'm saying, right? Lots of kids tell me that things have happened in their life that's very scary, right? Anything like that for you. And then the kid might tell me something, and then I might say, some kids tell me that people have touched them in ways they really didn't like. How about you? Has that ever happened in your life? Right? So it's very specific, but it's not intrusive, right? And also using the questioning strategy of focusing on forward action. So I might say, lots of kids tell me that they have some things in school that they don't feel really good about. And I really, part of my job is helping kids figure out those things and help them go better. How about you? What you got in school that you might want to have go better? Right? Things like that, where you're not just collecting, right? We're all trained to do assessment in a way that is like the full and fleshed out and flushed out collection of information. And that style of information collection can be very disengaging. And so we want to be clear that what we're asking is about our goal, right? It's about our action together. It's about our path forward. Always allow people the option not to answer and circle back. Always review confidentiality before you get started, not after you get started. And remember, just because you said something about confidentiality the first time doesn't mean you don't have to circle back and remind people of it. And make sure folks know about where the information you're sharing is going. So again, questioning techniques, getting a little more specific, preparation. Ask for facts, not judgments, right? How many drinks do you have a week, right? Versus, do you ever drink too much, right? Ask for facts, not judgments. Not, do you ever abuse your kid, but are there times when you discipline your kid in ways that you don't feel good about, right? You're not judging them, you're asking them for facts. Start with closed-ended questions and move from closed to open. You hear how I'm starting with questions that are yes and no in orientation, right? And then moving to a more open stance. Often when we're taught to do assessment and interviewing, we're taught to toggle back and forth, and that open-ended questions can expand the conversation. And indeed, that is true. But when we're talking about sensitive information, sometimes in the context of normalizing, if we ask yes/no questions, it can actually feel a little more safe and a little more contained. Okay. And you heard me ask things in ways that assume the behavior is occurring or the need is there, right? Always take care with the way that you ask. I would not advocate that anyone use the language on the HCBS items, right? That's not language that we would necessarily want people to be asked, right? Are you able and willing to participate in your child's treatment plan, right? That's kind of a crappy way to be asked. I wouldn't want to be asked that, It's more like, is there anything that gets in the way for you of feeling like you are a full player on your child's team, right? That's a nicer way to ask that same question, much more respectful, much more supportive. The other piece is to think about response choices. The action levers are great for this. And maybe you remember yesterday when we were talking about collaborative assessment, we talked about setting up a shorthand for the action level language with the people that you're serving, right? Teaching them, and it doesn't have to be the way that you see it on the slide. It can be, so I'm going to ask you to sort of put it in a category for me. It could be like, do nothing, keep an eye on it, do something right away. Start teaching them that language. And then when you get into these sensitive areas, once you've asked these gentle, respectful questions, you say, okay, so you're telling me that, that you really think you might like boys and that your mom and dad are not happy about that, right? So what do you think in terms of family communication and support for you? Is that something we would leave alone, check on every once in a while, do something, or do something right away, right? Then you can actually negotiate. You can negotiate action from that perspective, because if the kid says leave it alone, you can say, okay, how about this? A lot of the kids I work with who are in your position, really experience that if someone helps them talk with their family about it, they can get some better support. I don't think you need to do that now, but is it okay if I put a 1 and just keep checking with you on it? I will not touch it until I check back with you, right? So that's another way we're talking already about building consensus. Josh, were you gonna?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Rebecca had texted in just saying, praise is always a good thing peppered throughout the assessment, which I think is a really great point. And I would add gratitude to that too, right? The ability to say to someone, thank you for being so brave as to share that with me, or I'm really impressed with, how much you've accomplished given some of these challenges that you've spoken with me about, right? Yeah, those types of statements can go a long way to, to helping someone develop that level of comfort with us to continue sharing and to share even deeper and maybe more, more challenging information with us. Thank you for that. That's really good advice.
Well said. And then last but not least, right, how do we build consensus in the context of these engaged questioning strategies, right? Again, we're always going to have times where people are disagreeing about what's going on and what needs to happen next. And so what we like to encourage people to do is, again, use the action level approach, the action and function approach to help build consensus. Stay away from power struggles and value judgments and opinions, and focus people on where we're going. So you can use the action levels as numbers. You can average them among the players. You can describe what people see, right? So Johnny, you see that, you see your school behavior as a 0 because you don't care at all about school. With some teenagers, I might even say you don't give a shit about school if that's what the child has said to me, right? But Mom, you're saying that you're getting calls from the school every day and that they're talking about expelling him and that you think it's an emergency and you want to do something right away. Okay. So that's a place where you start to describe things in action forward language. And then you also want to make sure, we talked yesterday about that shared vision. As you're getting to know a kid and a family, you get to know what their goals are. So you might say to Johnny, okay, so Johnny, you really don't want to work on this, but I remember you telling me you do want your parents to get off your back, right? That was one of your goals. So Mom, in terms of this item, this area of school behavior and the calls from the school, what % of the time are you on his back about this? So you hear how I'm starting to try and move it into an area of consensus, right? And always translate disagreement by accurately framing the problem in terms of action, right? Not in terms of, Johnny, can't you see that? You don't want to say to Johnny, can't you see, Johnny, that your mom is really worried about you and she's really hurting at this time? And can't you see her perspective? No, you want to say, wow, so Johnny, you're getting a lot of heat from school. You're not interested in school. You don't want to work on it. Mom, you're feeling a lot of heat from school. You really want Johnny to work on it. So let's work on that from that perspective, right? It's not about getting people to agree on the values around the issue. So I want to double back about something Gus chatted in right before the break and just talk about, I actually remembered to talk about this morning, but I want to make sure and talk about it this afternoon. That a lot of times folks in all walks of life, but even in the professions, are uncomfortable asking about suicide, right? And there are a lot of different reasons for that. But one of the common reasons for that is this idea that asking someone if they're suicidal will plant the seed of suicidality in their mind. And so it's really important that we talk a little bit about what we know, right? There's a significant body of science around suicide and suicidology, right? How to prevent it. And it's based on a real study of people who have attempted but survived, and also events leading up to people who have successfully attempted, and also talking with folks, including young people who've had suicidal ideation or attempts, yeah? So what we know about suicide, first of all, in young people, is that suicidal ideation is is on the rise in children in our country, right? And that's a sad reflection, I think, of the kind of stressors that children, middle schoolers and teenagers are experiencing. And so now we find that children aged 10 and above, significant percentages of them report to us that they have thought about suicide at one point or another in their life, right? The other thing we know is that most people who have attempted suicide or thought about suicide will tell us that someone asking about it would have helped. Those who've thought about it but haven't tried have said, someone asked me about it and I was able to tell them how badly I was feeling and they offered me help and that helped, right? And one of the things that we know about people who complete suicide is that no one reached out to them or few people reached out to them in a way that might have been helpful. So as we learn to talk about suicide, the first thing to dispel is any myth that by asking about it, you're going to plant that seed. It's actually the opposite, right? We know this about trauma now too, that people who have trauma histories and experiences have told us now for several decades, please ask me, because I want to be able to at some point find a person who I can tell, right? Same with suicidal ideation. So throw that baby right out with the bathwater, right? Keep the baby, throw out the bathwater. Do not worry about asking about suicide. And remember that the strategies of normalizing that are really, really important, right? And sometimes I say something along the lines to a young person of, sometimes life can be stressful for all kids these days. And a lot of the kids I work with tell me that when things get really stressful, sometimes they think about wanting to die or wanting to hurt themselves. Anything like that ever cross your mind? Right? And that is not, right, a way that's going to insert that thought, but that is a way that's going to open the door for kids to talk about self-injury and suicide in a way that feels safe, right? So don't be afraid to bring it up. You're not going to hurt anybody. And indeed, what we know now is that you could help somebody, right? That you could help somebody. Great one. Good one, Gus. Thank you for that.
I had a bit of a follow-up with that.
Yeah.
There is a video, really good video about this young man. He's actually famous because they installed these barriers on the Golden Gate Bridge to catch people and he actually jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. So he goes into this whole thing about the day that he took the bus there, and it's really good. But just to kind of punctuate the absurdity of it, he's walking on the bridge on his way to jump off, and a woman encounters him. And she says to him, "Oh, can you take a picture of me and my boyfriend?" And yeah. And that was just really, nobody cares about me. That was, yeah. So just really good. If anybody, if you have a chance, you can look it up. It's on YouTube, but
yeah,
fascinating about that.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to care. Don't be afraid to ask. It goes back to that kindness and compassion, how powerful that can be. So let's talk a little bit about another set of questions. We're going to sort of turn a little bit on the road and talk about some of the questions that came in that folks had about how to assign action levels with unique populations. And there were two distinct populations that y'all send in repeated questions about, okay? So the first thing I want to do is, here's that birthday cake. I think we showed you this maybe on the first day on webinar 1. And these are those action levels, right? And remember, right, that the need is being rated 0 through 3, okay? Now, we've talked a lot about actionable needs being 2s and 3s, and you know that those 2s and 3s are sort of what's required for the HCBS eligibility determination, but I want to focus in on that 0 for a minute and that 1, okay? The 0, notice the definition. The definition is no evidence of a need, right? The definition is not, I know for sure, 100%, that this is not a need for this particular individual, right? What we're talking about is right now, based on what I know, there's no evidence of a need. That can mean a lot of things. It could mean I've really gotten to know this child, and I really know that for them, they're a good sleeper. They don't have any problems with sleep. There's no need on sleep here. It can mean I am unable to rate this with the information that I have. It can mean this item does not relate to the developmental age of the child that I'm rating. For many, many years, we had one version of the CANS in several jurisdictions, and it had an item about employment, vocational, and people would get really mad at me because they'd say, this 5-year-old, right? They're not going to have a job. And I'd say, yeah, that's why you just rate it a 0. You don't have to ask them that, do you have a job when they're 5? You're simply rating it. It's not applicable for this kid, right? So that 0 means a lot of things. And that 1, right, means a significant history of a need or a possible need that's not interfering with functioning. And also I want to add to that, it could be a possible need that you suspect, but you need more information on, so you want to do some follow-up. Okay. And so let me see if Colette is with us right now. Colette, it sounds like I'm wondering if you came back from the other side, right? Colette, are you with us? But
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you talk a little bit about, I would like to talk here about workflow. So that question that you addressed so well this morning about, if I find out something after the eligibility determination has been done, I put that 0 or that 1 in, and then later on I find out more. What should I do? How do I change that outcome once I find that out?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot. So if you've conducted an HCBS eligibility determination and the child is eligible for HCBS, then that assessment is good for 1 year. And any information you find out within the year that's new or updated, then that is the opportunity to update the plan of care. And then obviously make note of that change so that when you do your annual reassessment, or if there's a significant life event that comes up, that you know that information needs to be updated. If the child is not eligible and for some reason you find out more information, or you get, paperwork from a doctor's office or something, absolutely that you could go redo the HCBS assessment. But we also want to make a note that a couple things. The first thing is, 1 rating alone probably will not make a child from not eligible to eligible. It would be pretty rare. So just note that in the back of your head. Obviously, if the child was not eligible already, they would have had a notice of decision and could file a fear hearing. If you find out more information and you want to complete the HCBS reassessment, again, you totally can do that. But we need to be sensitive to families, because you don't want to say, oh, I got this paperwork, redo the assessment, and say, oh, you're still not eligible, right? So there's dialogue you should have with Sue Harrington and your supervisor. They can reach out to DOH. We can actually look at what you want to change and see if the algorithm would change at all. But I think the biggest piece is, as you serve a member in a child and family, that if you have updated information, that eligibility determination is good for a year. So your focus is really on updating the plan of care.
Great. Thanks, Colette. Any questions on that for Colette? Like a kind of a question, but okay, great. So now that we've sort of really clarified what that 0 is all about, let's move into the 2 specific populations that folks were asking about. So the first question that came in from several folks on the 2 webinars over the last few days was about infants. So how do I rate infants on items like mobility? How do I rate infants on items like positioning? And how do I rate items like transferring, right? I don't know how I'm going to do that. right? So the first thing is, remember that key characteristic we focused in on development on the first day, webinar 1. We said take development into account before assigning an action level. And we talked about that young man, Roberto, who was having tantrums, but he was 3 years old. And although tantrums are normal, we didn't want to overreact. Mom was also asking us to act, right? So the same is true of infancy, right? We need to take development into account. And in order to do that, we need to understand what is typical for infant development, right? And so you can look at this picture. This is just an example of a quick timeline of what's typical for major milestones in the first 12 months of a baby's life, right? Remembering that these are not exact, that they're more like ranges, right? And so if a baby doesn't begin to roll from their stomach to their back by exactly 6 months, that's not necessarily a problem. But you can sort of see here that a baby doesn't start moving toward motility and positioning until they're closer to a year, right? So we need to know what's typical. If an item is not relevant, if an infant is 2 months old, right, mobility, transferring, and positioning are zeros because they are simply not relevant to the child's functioning at that time, okay? So once we get up into an older child, we want to sort of know what's relevant to that age, okay? Once a child gets to the point where it's very clear that they've passed the timelines for crawling and walking, right? Not the exact, like at 12 months they haven't walked, right? We want to make sure that we give them a range. Things normally, right? Parents will begin to express concern about their infant's mobility, right? When they start talking about that, and that's part of the conversation, right? When providers who are noticing that the child's motor developmental milestones are not moving, that's when those items begin to emerge as relevant, okay? So one of the things I want to emphasize, though, is learning about development and knowing what is typical has to be done through credible resources. Now, you all are nurses, so you know this already, but oftentimes, right, we have sometimes in the paraprofessional and even the professional world, people might mistake Google or a search engine for a credible online resource about development. So I always like to point out this terrific resource at the Administration for Children and Families. This is in the Health and Human Services wing of our federal government. And I'm going to click on it now, and then I know I have to, hearing Josh's voice in my head. Susie, you have to share your screen. Okay, I'm not understanding why. Here we go. Hold on. He's my mentor. He's my digital mentor. Okay, here we go. So can you see that early childhood development webpage now, folks? Yeah? Okay. So this is a one-stop shop for credible resources on child health and development, and has a terrific set of resources for the 0 to 5 population. So if you just take this URL and you have questions about development, early intervention, right, education, behavioral health expectations in the early years, terrific resources here, and then lots of referrals to some of the most credible networks of information on child development and parenting resources that we have at our fingertips. Lots of these are all really terrific resources that I would recommend, right? And then moving down here, you can see some tips and tools on developmental monitoring and screening, fact sheets, materials, milestones, ways to talk about families around developmental progression that are strength-based, supportive, non-frightening, right? And so here, there are lots of resources here. It just kind of goes on and on, right? So this is a place where the Administration for Children and Families tries very hard to maintain active resources for providers and educators across the country. So now I'm going to come back to my slides, just talking myself through it. Okay. So that's number one. And Gus is telling us a story right now. He's saying that a good friend of his had a 2-year-old who wasn't talking and was worrying. He was going to get him evaluated and connected to speech therapy. And Gus said, right, the guidelines are guidelines. The milestones are not hardcore points of concern, and the flood of speech came on a few months later. And so, yes, that is so true, Gus, right? We don't want to frighten families. We want to balance that realization that milestones are not exact, but we also want to take into account the fact that those 0 to 5 years are when the brain is most plastic. And so when we identify challenges early, they're often more supportable and remediatable, right? So I also wanted to check in. I had a lot of questions from folks about nonverbal consumers, right? How do I assess the consumer who's nonverbal? We get this question a lot from care managers as well. And one of the things that they often ask us about is an item that is not on the HCBS eligibility, and that's the optimism item. They'll say to us, well, how do I assess optimism for a child who is nonverbal, right? And so there are a few strategies to think about. The first is make sure, right, as Josh said, he said this several times in our webinar week, this is a communimetric tool, and you want to rely on the community of stakeholders involved in the life of the child. So when you're doing assessment on a nonverbal consumer, you need to make sure to look hard at all of the referral information that you've got and have those conversations with people who know the child well and are serving the child. And part of the information that will come out of that is, what are the assistive strategies that can be used to communicate with this individual, and who knows the child best, often the caregivers and the family, and can support you in creative assessment strategies and being able to talk with the consumer about their priorities, right? And so a deep collaboration has to happen between you and the people who know that child best, right? So Rebecca is suggesting, for example, that in the DD population, she would ask, she would learn how the child communicates, right? Some children just blink their eyes. Some children use assisted communication boards. But the people who know the child well are going to help you understand that. And that's where you're going to start. And remember, you can be creative. You can turn your questions into yes/no questions if the child blinks, or if the child has a communication board where you need to ask a yes/no question, right? Also, remember, 0 equals no evidence. It doesn't equal absolutely no need. So you can, if you're unable to assess something, and you should, rate that item as a 0. So any questions on that before we move on? Okay. The last piece, and I'm kind of rushing to this because I know, Colette, I wanted to make sure you're on for this part of the conversation, because I know that process piece is going to come up in a minute. But we had lots of conversation and lots of questions about kids with autistic spectrum disorders, that you see these complex situations where kids come in, they have a possible diagnosis of ASD, and they also have some significant emotional and or behavioral challenges, and sort of questions like, how do we get them to where they need to go, and what bucket do they get served in? And the assessment process is very complex. And in a minute, Colette is going to talk about the process behind this and the vision behind this, but I just want to give you a little information before she does that, right? One of the reasons that you're encountering these challenging situations is actually because they're quite common, right? That kids with autistic spectrum disorders commonly have comorbid psychiatric behavioral challenges, okay? When we look at some of the big studies of this, we see that about 74% of kids with ASD overall have some sort of psychiatric challenge, about 44% of them behavioral or externalizing types of challenge, and about 38% of them things associated with executive functioning, like impulse control, attention, focus, organizational skills, right? Those kinds of things. Sensory tolerance, right? Can sometimes overlap in those two diagnoses. Really importantly though, right, when we look at kids with ASD, the prevalence of depression seems to be quite high, right? So kids with ASD, the range here in the research is 50 to 70% of children with ASD have depression. And so that makes a lot of sense. When you work with kids with ASD, you know that they may not have insight or they may not read social cues, but they are certainly often smart enough to know that something's not quite right with the way that things are going in their social world, right? And so often that can lead to some depression. And about half of kids with ASD, the estimate says, experience some form of what would be diagnosable or treatable anxiety, right? So it's really common what you're experiencing, that a lot of kids with ASD have these challenges. And so we really do want to sort of talk about how to get them to where they're going to get the best array of services. And the challenge that many of you identified in your questions was this difficulty with assessment and identification, because underlying ASD is the social communication and insight-oriented pieces that sometimes make it hard, right? So before Colette talks about the process piece, I want to emphasize a few strategies for this population that you're struggling with and encountering. Right? First of all, when you see a kid who has that sort of complex picture, multiple sources of information are critical, right? How is this child functioning in multiple environments? That's where that the current referral information, evaluations, right? Those are critical. And rely heavily on experts who understand the disorder and its impact on behavior, but define expertise broadly, right? Teachers, seasoned teachers who see a lot of kids in their career, they can give you a lot of information about the nuances of ASD, right? Caregivers, right, who know their kid well, right? This is not a kid that they're parenting from the perspective of my child has ASD. They're parenting an individual. They know that individual well, and regardless of whether the individual has insight into it, they often have a baseline understanding of where their child is around mood, around fear and anxiety, and around impulse control. So Colette, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the overview of where you see this population and the goals and the strategies?
Yeah, great. I think this is the group we talked to yesterday about the question regarding the developmental disability
Did we?
children and med-frag, and I shared with you all that we are updating the LPHA form so that each section, I see a shaking of the head there, so each section will be divided out so that when you send it to a provider, it will have the door, I'll say the door of either med-frag or SED, whatever door you think you're going to go through based on the information you've gathered for the HCBS assessment. We also, because it came up this morning, people brought up that sometimes when the form is sent to professionals, they don't know what the purpose is. So we have updated like what the purpose is. And of course, you know, sending a form alone is just not enough, obviously, but hopefully that will help you when you do send the form or follow up with conversation to explain that this is the process to get someone eligible. And, you know, this section of the form needs to be completed by a licensed professional. So we're hoping that helps. And then I think I mentioned, you know, with the information you gather and talking with professionals in the family, then you pick the door in the HCBS eligibility, right? The target population you are going to assess for, whether that's SED or med-frag. And I think you also know that we have the DD med-frag population. So that's complex for folks because there are some children with some critical and special needs that may meet the DD population as well as SED or med-frag. And so with our working with OPWDD and getting them OPWDD eligible, that does take several months to do that, plus a lot of paperwork that needs to be turned in. So it was brought up this morning, can these things take place simultaneously? And the answer is absolutely. So as you're gathering paperwork and documentation and information from the family, you can be going through the MedFrag UAS assessment tool with the family, as well as sending those documents to OPWDD. So you can get the child eligible for the children's waiver through the MedFrag door, get them connected to services while OPWDD is doing their thing to get them eligible at OPWDD. Once that happens at OPWDD, now the family has an array of services that they now can make choices about, right? So that I think is key. If you get information and everyone's like, this kid is DD, MedFrag, and you want to send them to OPWDD, you can definitely do that. But as I mentioned, there would be a gap in services because it takes longer to make that child eligible. So we did build the flexibility that if there's a child that's DD MedFrag, they most likely, a high percentage would be eligible through the MedFrag door. So that is our encouragement to everyone, is get the child eligible as quickly as possible and then work with the family and OPWDD to give them other choices should they eventually be OPWDD eligible. And this is super important for those transitional youth. So usually children in the children's waiver who, you know, are older teens, becoming young adults, they will probably transition instead of the adult health home program, they would transition to OPWDD. So it's really important to make sure the family is connected to OPWDD and determined eligible there, even if they want to stay in the children's waiver, so that when they turn 21 years old, they can benefit from OPWDD without a gap of services and transitioning to those services.
Great. Any questions about that? I forgot that we had done that yesterday, but yeah. Any questions about that?
So it says, is there an estimated date for the separation of the LPHA? You know, yeah, 4 months ago. So I'm hoping in the next couple weeks, with going through its final, you know, looking through with all the leadership and our state partners. So hoping to get that out as soon as possible. We have heard that is like one of the biggest barriers to moving forward. Thank you for the thank goodness. So we'll all cross our fingers. The other thing is just you're the first to know really is we are putting an amendment into our waiver to go to CMS. That will take a couple months, but we are changing who the licensed practitioners of the healing arts. Actually, we're adding to it. So that is another thing that we've heard is a big barrier, is the limited number of providers that can sign the form. And if a child is seeking a provider that's not on that list, it's been, you know, 10 times more difficult to try to connect the child to an appropriate provider to sign the form. So again, we're hearing lots of feedback from you guys as well as other stakeholders and trying to be responsive as possible.
So there's another question, which I think I can, well, maybe Colette, this one might be for you as well. I don't understand the fraud piece, Gus, so maybe you can talk about that. But Angela is saying, what about the child with ASD that is most appropriate for SED because of behavioral issues, but the MD refuses to sign the LPHA because ASD is not one of the diagnoses on the form? So Colette, you got any ideas on that one?
ASD is not, well, autism alone, right, is not SED, right? So there would have to be, for you to go through the SED door, they would have to have some other diagnosis. So we do know that kids have dual diagnosis, right? They're autism plus they have maybe depression or some kind of learning difficulties or some other things. So that I would think that would be appropriate, that if the doctor doesn't have an SED diagnosis for autism, they're not going to sign that section of the form. right? And then you would not be able to go through the SED door, so to speak, in the UAS because you don't have the SED diagnosis where you have a mental health diagnosis. So if a kid has autism and mental health, then you can coordinate with that doctor to sign the SED section of the form to make that child eligible as quickly as possible and articulate to that professional that you're also working with OPWDD to get them eligible in that arena and connected to have choices, but this is the quickest option. And I think, again, the separation of the form will help a lot because you'll be sending one section, right? And you'll be able to have that information that supports it instead of a professional looking at all the different target populations and disagreeing with you how to proceed.
Great, thanks, Colette. Okay, so I think this this header slide was here to sort of check in about cultural humility and responsiveness, but I think that we have sort of woven that into the rest of the day. There were questions. I think someone this morning had a specific question about working with Hasidic Jewish families, and we talked a lot about that this morning. But just anybody have any questions or thoughts about some of the challenges that you've encountered and some of the strategies you've used to work with families from different cultural backgrounds than your own? Anything that you would like to bring up? Gus is it right. Gus is saying some cultures don't believe in mental illness. Yeah, that can be challenging. Or it's talking about it as taboo. Someone's talking about Muslim families. It's hard to advocate for the woman with the husband, right? So we're being culturally responsive by working through the husband, but it can be challenging to find ways to be an advocate for the woman in the household. Other ideas? So, in transparency is key. Admit your own ignorance and ask them to teach you about their cultural heritage. That's beautiful, right, Angela? That ratchets right back to what we said earlier about our lenses, right? Our lenses. So in all of those examples, right, we come in and we have our own lenses about how we frame mental illness and how we frame gender politics in a family, right? And so it is really starting with them. Where do they see and how do they frame their child's challenges with behavior, right? And maybe not even using the term mental illness, right? So the idea here is, again, that same piece we talked about with engagement, that whatever we come up against, we remove the against by opening our hearts and minds and being curious and finding a path in by finding out how the family defines its relationship to that issue and then working through that, right? And so these are the strategies we want to encourage you to think about, not cultural competence, because to us that's a very limited way of thinking about culture, but humility and responsiveness, where we go into a Muslim family understanding that our beliefs about gender politics and gender dynamics in a marriage and our biases about what it might look like to be in a Muslim marriage, right, are not the things to put at the front of the table. Curiosity and responsiveness to that person and their experience in their marriage is really the most important piece, right? And so this can be challenging. Josh, do you want to add anything here?
No, I mean, I think you took the point that I would make, right? Which is sort of getting out of that mindset that being culturally competent is even a thing that's possible, right? There are how many of us right now? 22 of us on this call. I am competent in exactly one of your cultures, and that's me, and really just barely. Right. So like and that's okay. You know, it's okay to acknowledge, right? So we talk more about being culturally humble, right? Showing cultural humility and being willing to ask, being willing to explore, being willing to accept that we'll probably put our foot in our mouth at some point because that's human nature and we all make mistakes, and being okay with that as long as we're willing to do the right thing to try to overcome that and to try to continue to be humble and to try to understand the people that we're serving, right? And so, you know, that's a point that we make heavily in some of our other trainings as well, where we really try to put ourselves into that mindset that it's okay to not be culturally competent. It's okay to recognize that that's really something that's almost impossible to be when we're working with a large and diverse group of people.
Great, well said. So we've ranged across a lot of the areas that summarize themes of the submitted questions that you put in over the last few days. And before we move to sort of a quick review of the supports that we have in the CANS Institute, we wanted to check in with you. Are there other examples, questions, things that you'd like to talk about or have us talk with you about that we want to throw out before we move on? Trying to sort of see everybody here. Okay. Josh, you want to grab the screen and sort of do some review about some of the resources that we can offer you from the New York Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've heard us mention this a few times over the last few days, and I'll mention it again, our website, right, which is kansnewyorkinstitute.org. So I'm sharing that with you now. The main screen kind of looks like this, and I highly recommend that you bookmark this page and take advantage of us when you can. So Susie and I represent kind of a larger group of folks that are working across New York State, which we call the CANS Institute, and that's a training and technical assistance group that involves Susie and myself from the Parade Foundation, as well as lots of partners with Department of Health and with various agencies around the state who provide coaches and other members of our leadership group who do a number of supportive activities, in particular for your colleagues in care management at the health homes for serving children team and program around the state. And so we do a lot of work with folks, helping them get over their CANS assessments that they have to take annually, as well as doing a lot of in-person coaching and support around actually using the CANS in practice. So our resources are available to you as well, though your access to them might be a little different than some of those care managers that we support, because for you folks as members of the CYES group, your sort of requests for that technical assistance kind of go through your own team and through Department of Health first, and then they may or may not choose to kind of access us to help provide that additional support to you as they see necessary. But some of the work that we do in producing some of our content is available to you really anytime you want to access it. So obviously today's training is a part of that, but also on our website is this resources page, which we highly recommend, again, that you bookmark our page and utilize this resources page, which has a lot of great information here and is ever growing. We are constantly kind of working on new stuff and putting new stuff up here. And so the opening section is kind of around training and certification. This relates more to the CANS itself for those care managers. So not super relatable for you folks, but we do have some info there. But then as we scroll down the page, one of the areas that I think will be really valuable to you folks is this tip sheet section. And we have a number of PDFs that are available here. They're nice bright colors and are easily printable if you have a color printer, or not. They'll print fine in black and white too. But these can be printable or just savable if you wanted to save them to something on your devices. But we have quite a few concepts here that we think are really useful to folks. One of which is just kind of a basic, kind of understanding of the CANS New York and the action levels, right? And so this applies to the entirety of the CANS New York, which you folks don't necessarily complete the entire thing, but the concepts are still the same, right? So that there's some content here around the needs and the strengths and thinking about those action levels. there's some context here around the guiding principles and those key characteristics that Susie and I have talked about. And then we have a number of tip sheets that actually dive deeper into those key principles, right? So we have one that talks about sort of, again, doing a deeper dive into action levels. We have one that talks about ratings, describing the individual and not the individual in care. We talked a bunch about that on day one, right? About rating the kid and trying to think about the kid and not the services that they're in. We have one that's on thinking about kids as developmentally appropriate. And this tip sheet is a really cool one that I like a lot because it talks a bit about thinking about kids by their true age and also by their developmental age, right? So we give some examples here of like a 10-year-old who's developmentally 4, and then how that rating might look for a given item based on that developmental age versus another child who's 10 and is developmentally 10 and might be exhibiting a similar behavior, and therefore that rating might actually be a 2 for them, right? Because whatever behavior we're talking about might be really not developmentally appropriate for somebody who's developmentally 10 years old, right? So we have kind of a cool tip sheet there and a number on a number of different topics. And then for quite a few of these, the what, not the why, the 30-day window, and one about our caregiver section, we also have these real cool interactive we call them digital tip sheets. And because of the way these are designed, they're actually hosted over on our training site, which this link takes you to. You do have to have an account on the training site. Many of you might already have this. If you don't, it's super easy to just sign up and get yourself an account. It's totally free. But when you follow that link and then log into our site, it takes you to these courses where we have these digital tip sheets that can be actually viewed. And I'm not going to make you sit through them, but it's kind of cool to see a little bit of what they look like because they can be interactive and actually give us a chance to, give you a chance to actually kind of click through and think about some of the concepts. Oh, that's it. We're on the last one. So for instance, I'm trying to look for one of my favorite pieces. Oh, so like this is one of the one of the slides that we have on here where it actually gives a little mini vignette and then gives you a chance to. I'm just going to pause that, but it gives you a chance to actually select some of the ratings for particular items. This is for the supervision item. Again, these are related to the entire CANS New York, so some of the items might be relevant to what you do for the HCBS eligibility. Others may not be because we're covering a larger swath of items, but these tip sheets can be real cool and they're kind of interactive and a fun way to kind of do some additional learning. So we encourage you to take advantage of those. We think that we put a lot of work into them, so we're proud of them, but we also think that they can be really valuable and useful to the work that you're doing. And then as you can see, there's a number of other tip sheets. We also have a section here where we post some of the webinars that we do. This one from last year is one that I did for care managers around rating multiple caregivers, but I think it could apply to some of your folks as well as you're thinking about that concept we talked about earlier about why do we want to rate all the caregivers that are involved for a child and not just a single parent. So that was a webinar I did last year. Susie mentioned this earlier. This is a webinar we did just a couple of weeks ago, talking about really how do we sort of do this work of collaborative assessment in the world of COVID, right? How do we do it via Zoom meetings, via phone calls, via this sort of social distancing that's been foisted upon us. And so we spent a few hours really kind of diving into that. And so this is a recording. Actually, we did that twice. So this is actually a compilation of both of those. We took the best moments from each and put them together as a video. So we have that there. And then we also have a section around some of our DOH resources, right? Some of this goes back to the DOH website and to some of the resources that they have available for folks in this system. And so this page is ever evolving. We're adding more material to it as we produce more material and record these types of webinars and things. So we highly encourage you to utilize this page, to reach out to Susie and myself as you have questions or have thoughts. We kind of look at this as a good opportunity to continue our relationship with you and to really be thoughtful about how our institute and how the work of our team can support you and the work that you're doing with kids and families.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Karen's chatted in another question that I did see this question, Karen, and it dropped off the slide radar this morning. But Karen's asking us about an adolescent male who has serious emotional disturbance, who's been hospitalized in a private RTF for an extensive period, more than 18 months. Do you think the length of that admission is more a reflection of the family not being able to handle stress, or more related to the severity of the child's symptoms? But most importantly, is this relevant to the HCBS level of care determination?
Patty, do you think I'm wasting too many torches?
And I would say, I don't care what Isaac says, but I have an opinion. So first of all, I want to go to the end of the question. It's highly relevant, Karen, because the whole intention of HCBS services is to keep kids out of and get kids out of restrictive settings. Restrictive settings, as we know, are not the best place for any child, right? The best place, when we look at populations who are pulled from their home communities, whether it's for medical hospitalization, psychiatric placement, foster home placement, or incarceration, those populations have one thing in common. Things don't turn out very well for people who are taken out of their home communities for lengthy periods of time. It's just not a good idea. And we know, right, we've talked so much about those resilience factors for families earlier today. We thought about in our care coordination segment yesterday, Charles's strengths and how important building those strengths for him in his community and capitalizing on his connection to his family, how important that is, right? So yes, it's relevant. The HCBS services are there to get kids out of and keep kids out of places like an RTF. So I was in the RTF and RTC system for a long time. It's where I started my career. And I wouldn't be able to tell you what the reason is for the length of this individual's placement in an RTF, right? Unless I knew the case a little bit better, right? But I can say that there are some common contributors to children staying in long-term care. The first is one that New York State has done a great deal of work on in the 20-some years I've been practicing here, and that is that community-based services have not always been adequate to receive children and give families adequate supports, right? So that sometimes contributes, right? For much of the state now, we have much better supports for kids on the community level in that area. Another place where we often see children in extensive or repleted placements has to do with that issue of family, right? And that is not about families not being able to handle stress, but for whatever reason, the child not having that relationship stability that we talked about when we were going through the items, right? It's so important for a child to have one significant person or more than one who's known that child his or her whole life. If a child's primary caregivers were disrupted early on as a result of whatever, trauma, loss, substance use and abuse, incarceration, and that child wound up in repeated placement, sometimes a child can get to the point where they don't have a connection to family members who can receive them, and that is not a good predictor. And certainly, rarely, right, rarely we have kids who have such significant severe symptoms that they may need to be in a restrictive setting for a longer period of time. So often what I see for most kids is it's a perfect storm, right? It's not one thing or the other. But it's so relevant because the work we're doing here, all the work we're doing, is managing and supporting and coordinating care for youth who have complex needs so they can get the heck out and stay the heck out of restrictive placement. And I would encourage you, Karen, if you see a situation like that the DOH team they're deeply committed to this vision of getting kids the services they need in their home communities. And so that's a great situation to call that team's attention to and ask for their consultation and support. And you didn't sound judgmental at all, right? I think it was a great question. Okay, we're viewing Josh's screen, but I am going to take it back, taking back the night. Gus, can you just chime right in and clarify what it is you want to talk about? Because I might be a little lost in the chat. And just remind us.
Yeah, sure. you know, the first part was had to do with autism, and you guys addressed that pretty well. And the second part, I'll just read from my email. So another issue that we have too often come across is with MedFrag children that may be stable in that 30-day window of the assessment. In these situations where the child might be experiencing a period of stability, wouldn't it be better to connect the family at least with minimal services, as there's no way to predict when this family would be in crisis? If the medical diagnosis is clear, what's the harm in at least having support set up versus having these children be unqualified and the case being closed with the family informed to reapply if circumstances change?
Mm-hmm.
It's a balance that we're constantly trying to strike between undertreating and overtreating, but at the very least, there should be something in place so that these families that have really sick children who are stable at the moment HCBS is done could get connected to services as quickly as possible without having to endure the bureaucratic process all over again if their circumstances change. This is a frustrating concept for the NEs, and at least some of their frustration is rooted in the fact that it seems misleading that we're developing these relationships, going through all of these hoops and hurdles to get the right documents to get HCBS, and when faced with a medical diagnosis that is real and debilitating and life-threatening, the child winds up not qualified. This seems especially traumatic, not only for the family, but for the NEs having to share this news. And it's almost like a slap in the face to the families who have reached out for help and can't get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And it feels like, it feels particularly challenging because what all of you really want to do is make sure these kids with intense medical needs have just that right dose, right? And that support that they need, and not have to wait until a deterioration in order to go through another evaluation, because we all know how much stress there is in the lives of these families already. So that's a really great question. And again, right, it's very, very complex, your question, and it has a number of components. And I can tell you a couple of things. So one of the pieces that DOH, I think I've mentioned this, but I haven't talked at length about it. One of the pieces that DOH has asked me to do in preparation for this training was to go through a group of cases that you all have struggled with over the last year or so, right? So I had a group of cases and I was able to review the referral information and the CANS ratings. And so I have a little bit of insight into where this sometimes goes awry, not all the time. What I saw was two things that I think contribute to this. And let me be really clear, they're not 100% of the cases you're describing, right? Indeed, there might be some cases where kids are stable, they don't appear, as far as the determination is concerned, to need the higher level of service, right? And then, right, we're waiting for that stability to get shaky. And that is not the intention of the system. The intention of the system is, as we said, it's that right dosing balance, right? But I do see some cases where two things seem to contribute to the information about the child's functioning not matching the story that I hear you telling, which is such a compelling story. One of those is the masking principle is not incorporated into the ratings. That's a really important one. And so remember, I was joking with y'all in webinar one, like if you sleep through the whole webinar, please just wake up for this part, right? If I could change one piece of your practice that I think would shift some of your frustration in this area, it would be to use that masking tip sheet flow chart before you rate any of the items with MedFrag kids. Okay, so that's number one. Really thinking about, if I pulled that question, right? If I pulled this equipment, if I pulled this skilled nursing, if I pulled this assisted respiration support, if I pulled these orthotics, if I pulled, right? So somebody fill in some other things, nurses. Give me some other examples, right? You know I'm a shrink. I got these things at the tip of my fingers. What are we thinking? What are some of the other supports that you see that are solidly in place? If I pulled them, then there would be what? Would the risk be in 30 days, this kid would be so ill that they would be PT, OT, speech, right? Is that kid developing only because of therapy, medications, respiratory treatments, right? Kids with needs regular percussions in order to clear their lungs, and if they didn't get them, they would begin to slowly suffocate, right? So I would say I'm not sure that PT, OT, and speech would qualify as that kind of an urgent medical support, right? Nursing for catheterization or feedings, right? Trach care, excellent examples. So you can have a very stable situation where a kid's trach is working well, nursing is in and out, right? Family is able to kind of support it. But if you pulled that skilled support, what would happen? If in 30 days that child would not be alive or would be placed, right, would be hospitalized in the ICU, that's your 3 on that item. If in 90 days, not 30, but 31 to 90, that child would be in trouble, that's your 2 on that item. Okay, so I want you to focus in on that masking principle. I don't think you can say that about PT and OT. I think PT and OT are progressive developmental supports. But I do think you can say that, for example, about a kid who cannot walk without supportive orthotics, right? A kid who is wheelchair bound and cannot self-care without support. A kid who cannot breathe fully without respiratory support. A kid who cannot get enough nutrition without a tube, right? So you want to start thinking about those questions. Use that masking flow chart. That's going to help you. The other piece I saw, and I actually don't know if this is something you have choice about, is I saw that sometimes you're doing the evaluations on what looks like fairly old information in the life of a child. And Gus, I don't know what that's about. I saw one example where there was a 3 or 4-year-old child and all the evaluations were from when the child was 2. And there was no current information on functioning. Does that often happen to you all? Or no?
Well, sometimes I know generally just across the board, one challenge that a lot of the nurses have is with getting documentation from facilities and hospitals. And a lot of that really has to do with people not understanding HIPAA.
Yes.
I know myself. I had an example when I was on an ACT team where one of my clients was hospitalized. I went to the ER to see him. I had a 20-minute conversation with the attending who had cleared him for discharge and was just letting him know we were an ACT team, we follow up. And I said, just as a matter of course, here's my card. Can you fax us the discharge summary? Yeah. And oh no, I can't do that. That's a HIPAA violation. But we were just talking for about a half an hour. And we went over to the client who verified who I was, gave permission for the doctor to speak to me, and it was still, so I know that often is a big barrier with nurses getting that information. So what happens is sometimes they have to depend on what the families have, and some of what the families have will be dated.
Okay, so that is one of the places too. And again, these are like, if you sort of broke up the pie, like one would be a big slice of the pie, I think, the masking principle, and another would be sort of a quarter slice of the pie. And then there are other concerns and issues that we're going to be figuring out as this transformation moves forward. But I would encourage you, and I think we're going to have a debriefing with DOH and the CYES leadership team next week. I think Josh already set it up, but we're going to talk about looking at workflow, some of the things I saw in these case reviews and some of the pieces of feedback you all have given, and making sure that, right, you can't guesstimate a 3-year-old's functioning based on, or 4-year-old's functioning based on an evaluation that he had when he was 2. There are so many dramatic changes in the life of a child. So Right. And so again, right, when we think about taking development into account, some of the ratings that would be relevant for a 4-year-old might not be relevant for a 2-year-old. So we're going to be talking about that. But in the meantime, to work on this piece, think about getting really assertive and, sort of going up the food chain about your challenges with getting the records you need, right? And also thinking about that masking principle as a team, really using those strategies. It's a great example. Okay, anything else that we have missed? I'm just going to go back, make sure I didn't miss anything. Josh, do you see anything we've missed?
No, I think we've hit everything.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so Josh has already done this. We're not going to do it again. Thanks so much for your participation, all these great questions and all your great conversation, everybody. It's been a real joy. We don't usually like hanging out on Zoom for 3 days, but you've made it a lot of fun. It's been really fun to work with you.